Hello, my name's Chris, what's yours? And welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning. And you join me at the Third Doctor's first proper trip off-world. The beginning of this era of Doctor Who felt like a sharp left turn and shook the programme up so much that it barely retained any of its old DNA. That was actually really invigorating, and naturally once it's settled, and I am of the opinion that it settled a little bit too quickly at the beginning of Season 8, it naturally becomes a little bit more difficult to remember how Doctor Who used to be cooked, what ingredients it would use, and how it used to taste. Halfway through the second year of this new format feels like just the right time to stretch its parameters a little bit and maybe, just maybe, reach out to the old way of doing things. Not that it's that simple, of course, because I think if you scratch the surface of Colony in Space, you'll actually find that Malcolm Hulke is using the framework of Doctor Who of yore to comment on its new iteration, and in so doing, it kind of distorts it a little bit. Both the framework and the new iteration. It is worth pointing out that I missed out on the 1970s, but gleaning what I can from lengthy and passionate familial accounts, there seemed to be a kind of prevalent pessimism throughout the decade. And I have to admit that that sometimes does seem evident in the televisual output from the decade that I have seen. It's here too because this story feels grim from the start. Intentionally so, of course, and it is used as a very, very good storytelling tool. A quick trip to space in the Ambassadors of Death and a flying visit to elsewhere in the Claws of Axos notwithstanding, this is our first time with the Third Doctor properly off-world. And unlike the gleaming spacey travel capsules of when the show went back to its old ways in The Dominators, everything here is low-key, run down and falling apart, and that is a wonderful touch by Malcolm Hulke. First of all, because it isn't how most shows would present their triumphant return to space and time travel, it's the opposite of that. We've got the Doctor travelling to another planet in the future for the first time in years, and for the very first time ever for this particular Doctor. So it would follow to go all out and shoot for the most sci-fi, future-y future attainable. Uninterested in that, it instead takes the more grounded approach of 70s Who so far and does sci-fi, future-y future through that lens. For want of a more appropriate word, Hulke seems to be striving for the real. That's why we have discussions about having yielded no crops and being beholden to red tape, seemingly designed specifically to stifle good, honest, working people. Rather cleverly, the colonist's predicament also seems to support Jo's initial questioning at the beginning of this story, of why she and the Doctor can't just go back to Earth. Why did the colonists leave Earth for this, she seems to wonder. That the current Earth is then painted a picture of, and instead of having progressed some way to being a utopia as mankind would hope for, and, in our constant naivety come to expect, it is instead dreadful, seems to answer this. Where they are isn't exactly the Garden of Eden, but is it a better alternative? Having this question asked throughout the story gives the supporting cast a really decent backstory, and I think it's rather neat seeing a future colony on another planet in its infancy having tribulations such as crops not taking hold. By approaching a future space colony in much the same way as he approached a power station in Wembley Moor, Hulke offers a really lovely slant on the space traversing elements of Doctor Who by making sure it remains in keeping with the current earthbound component. Watching Colony in Space, buoyed up by having enjoyed the previous story following two, let's call them wobbles, I realised that it's actually a much richer meal than I'd previously thought. I had always enjoyed Colony in Space, but I think I'd only ever enjoyed it at face value. This time around, I noticed, when previously it had passed me by, that the motivations and drivers for the characters needn't be set on an alien planet to be interesting. That it is set where it is makes for a nice change, and the fact that the characters have very relatable problems means that Hulke makes the sci-fi element the backdrop, rather than the primary focus, a hallmark, I think, of the better examples of science fiction. Had Doctor Who previously attempted a story like this, I imagine the colonists would have been in impractical dress and speaking in lengthy, drawn-out and ultimately useless sentences. Instead, we end up with characters like Caldwell, who is excellent, walking around with moral indignation until his ethics falter slightly when he realises he might be able to get enough money to retire on. Even then, it isn't unlimited power or an unimaginable fortune, as is so often the case when carrots are dangled in front of these science fiction types. No, this is as mundane as him wanting to get out of debt and quit his job. It is a good move by Hulk to juxtapose the fantastic with the everyday. It works excellently in the case of Caldwell, but it seeps into the entire story as well. And it's because of this that I think it really elevates it into being the best story in the season so far. That he then succumbs to his moral code anyway and breaks his contract to save Joe carries so much more weight because we know how high the stakes for him were and what now the consequences will be. When he decides to remain with the colonists at the story's end, it isn't just a culmination of his own personal journey, it also goes some way to answering that niggling question running through the story. Why leave Earth for this? And rather pessimistically, I do feel like Hulk is saying, because no matter how difficult it is out here, it's still a damn sight better than how Earth currently is. So yeah, even though this on the surface could look like Doctor Who of old, the 1960s back to its boundless sense of travel into space, I do think this story retains the 1970s bleakness. I do think it's justified though, and it's a legitimate way of telling a story, especially this one. Bleakness can certainly provoke a reaction, and the ship exploding, seemingly with all of the colonists on, is a prime example of that. In fact, it is imperative for this story to have been as bleak as it has been, so that you believe it's happened. Had it not been quite as grey and overcast throughout, there'd have been a bigger niggle at the back of your mind that it was all just a ploy and nobody was really on that ship. As it happens, because it has been so grey and overcast throughout, it is deeply plausible that the story had just done away with everybody. And then we find out it didn't happen. Then we find out that Ash sacrificed himself, and while that, isn't quite as bad as being everybody in the colony, it is still a downer and emotionally affecting. And therefore it's a really successful weaving of the Doctor Who of old with the then current iteration of the show. This is a Hartnell or a Troughton space adventure story, but through a Pertwee era lens. And that cocktail is incredibly delicious. This story goes along so nicely that if the Time Lords hadn't given it away in the very first scene, then you wouldn't expect the Master to show up at all. His reveal is really good, but it would have been superb if the Time Lords hadn't spoiled it 30 seconds in. It's no secret that I really like the Master so far, to the point where I think he's this season's MVP, so I'm not disheartened to see him again. His scenes with the Doctor are always fun to watch, and here is no exception. Their relationship is great, and the Master relishing impersonating the Adjudicator is just fun. Something the Master of the classic series isn't much remembered for, despite Delgado's joyous performance. While the Time Lords giving away that the Master will show up is an odd decision, seeing them again and their decision to use the Doctor as an agent to retrieve the stolen weapon plans from the Master is a good way of getting the Doctor off-world without actually breaking his exile, bending the new format of the show without breaking it. Last time, we saw the third Doctor tinkering with the TARDIS console in the TARDIS for the very first time, and I remarked about how strange and comforting it was, and it continues to be so here, although slightly more comforting and slightly less strange. The first time we see him stepping out of the TARDIS onto an alien planet comes with a nicely nostalgic vibe. I had always obviously thought, this is the same man. I'd been watching the third Doctor's era going, this is the same Doctor as I've been watching from the very first episode. But here, in that moment, he felt ever so slightly more like the same man. It's as if an ingredient from Doctor Who had been removed and it's now been given back to Pertwee, and he gets to do that first and second Doctor thing of stepping out of the TARDIS onto a new landscape. And it's really, really nice to see. Joe's reaction to the Doctor's talk of space and time travel being true after all is really delightful. It feels like a very real reaction, which is once again played impeccably by Manning, who I do not think has dropped the ball once, even though her writers may have several times. And, rather lovelier, it implies that all of this time, through the terror of the Autons, the mind of evil, and the claws of Axos, she's retained a kind of scepticism about it. And in all of those stories, whenever he's been talking about the TARDIS being a space-time machine, she's just kind of been humouring him. And I love that. She is better served in this story, and rather quietly but confidently, she is reaching her potential as a character. This better handling is a gift to Manning, who was already doing exemplary work with very little, and she makes the most out of it as Jo gets to grips with her first trip in time and space. Katie Manning had Jo coloured in from the start, and now it feels like the show is catching up with her. And I'm over the moon to report that the Doctor is wonderful again. He treats the colonists in a friendly and charming way, and furthermore, his scorn and disdain are reserved for exactly the right people. Watching these traits of Pertwee's Doctor be brought out into the wider universe is actually quite thrilling to see. Seeing him in a context we're familiar with seeing Hartnell and Troughton both in further cements that fact that we are watching the same hero that we have been watching since An Unearthly Child. When he catches the spear that's chucked at him, it's a hoot, like Daniel Craig in Casino Royale 35 years later. The ensuing fight is entertaining as well, but the fact that it takes place in a setting which we're used to seeing Hartnell and Troughton in helps to coalesce Pertwee's performance with the wider show. The scene in The Romans, the gentle art of fisticuffs, is played for laughs. We have never seen the Doctor do this in his space travels. Have a fight scene like this and acquit himself this well. So it marks Pertwee apart from his two predecessors. In a good way, considering that this is a unique string to this Doctor's bow, at the same time as reiterating that this is the same man. Okay. Maybe it's 2 episodes too long, but this is a solid story, and considering we have spent so long on Earth up until now, this doesn't just work on its own merits, it also works in easing Doctor Who back out into the wider universe of space and time travel after having been stuck for so long. 298 episodes done, and I am hurtling towards the end of Pertwee's second season, and will it continue that upswing in quality that this second half has had?
Are you some kind of scientist?
I'm every kind of scientist.
The immediate spoiler that the Master will show up. Obviously, we all know that he's in every story of Season 8. But I think the removal of his name from that first scene would make his subsequent appearance later much weightier. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this marrying of Doctor Who tones, then you know how YouTube works. Please do hit the like thumb and share it around. And what do you think of Colony in Space? Is it the best of the season so far, or do the throwbacks to old Doctor Who taint the flavour of the new? Is the bleakness an advantage, or is it all just too damn beat, or do you even find it bleak at all? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for the final story in Season 8. So, if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll meet you in Devil's End.